Running a learning business today requires attention to growing reach, generating revenue, and demonstrating real impact, all while navigating constant change and fierce competition for learners' time and money.
To help, we've curated a collection of free resources for learning business professionals. You'll find frameworks, briefings, and reports, webinars, and tools focused on strategy, portfolio design, pricing, marketing, and more, all created specifically for organizations that sell continuing education and professional development.
If you care about building a stronger, more sustainable learning business, visit leadinglearning.com/free resources.
That's leadinglearning.com/free resources for practical tools and strategic insight to help you grow your reach, revenue, and impact.
If you want to grow the reach, revenue, and impact of your learning business, you're in the right place. I'm Celisa Steele.
I'm Jeff Cobb, and this is the Leading Learning Podcast.
In many learning businesses, decisions about what to offer don't come consistently from one clearly defined place. Instead, decisions about what to offer are shaped by committees, volunteers, subject matter experts, executives, and staff across the organization.
And having a lot of people involved is not necessarily a problem, but it is a problem when it's not clear who owns the portfolio and who has the authority to make key decisions about it.
That lack of clarity has consequences. You can end up with scattered offerings, duplication, inconsistent pricing, weak prioritization, and very little discipline around what should be improved, rethought, or retired.
So in this episode, we want to talk about what happens when responsibility for the learning portfolio is too dispersed, why that's more than a low-grade nuisance, and what it takes to bring greater coherence to how decisions get made.
We'll look at what this problem tends to look like in practice, why input is not the same thing as decision rights, and why intentional portfolio management starts with being clear about who decides what.
Because decisions about your learning portfolio are being made one way or another, the question is whether they're being made consciously, coherently, and by the right people.
So we'll start by explaining a little bit more a pattern that we tend to see repeatedly in organizations that we work with on the consulting side of things, especially association learning businesses. And in brief, that is that many people have a hand in the learning portfolio.
That's right. I mean, your average association in particular, though this can apply to many types of learning businesses, but you're going to have committees, you're going to have volunteers involved, you're going to have subject matter experts as usually a subset of those volunteers, often executives weighing in, not necessarily executives who have any responsibility for the learning function, and different staff groups who have different needs related around education that maybe they're charged with delivering that, again, may or may not fall within whoever is actually in charge specifically of learning at the organization.
And as you already pointed out, Jeff, we don't necessarily see having a lot of people involved necessarily as a problem. And in fact, when a lot of people care about education and learning, that can be a good thing. But a problem arises when too few people have clear responsibility.
Right, clear responsibility and clear accountability around the decisions that get made. And the result of that, which again we see so often, is an incoherent portfolio. You get scattered offerings, you get duplication of effort, of content, you get inconsistent pricing, weak prioritization, a little discipline around sunsetting, and basically we see catalogs and just the portfolio of offerings essentially just kind of accumulate over time in a scattered fashion.
So that's the pain point that led us to want to have this conversation today. What this looks like in practice, to go a little bit deeper, is that very often you might have one committee making decisions around webinar topics, for example, but then you might have an entirely different committee that is looking at conference session submissions, for example.
Right. And in fact, in both of those areas, you might have multiple committees doing those things. You're lucky if it's just one committee oftentimes. And you might have, one department that handles the annual conference and other events, and then another one that's handling things like online courses or seminars that the organization offers.
And these committees, these departments, these groups are not necessarily talking to one another. And even when everything technically sits under the umbrella of education, under the umbrella of an education department, it's still possible that no one is truly seeing the whole portfolio. And as you said, not just having a responsibility for that, but also having accountability around that.
Yeah, and this is especially true in organizations where there are a lot of committees or multiple departments across the organization either have a need to or are charged with creating some form of educational content to serve their particular constituents, which is all legitimate, but it just gets hard to know kind of what's going on where. And again, those things we've already talked about, duplication and that sort of stuff, is just occurring all the time. And what can often happen in those sorts of organizations is that education staff really get treated as kind of service providers or implementers rather than business stewards, people who really are strategically leading a learning business forward and have that coherent and cohesive vision of what's happening.
Right. When you're saying that they get treated as service providers, it's sort of like the other groups might come to them with essentially an order saying,
make this webinar for us.
Exactly. And then the education staff aren't necessarily empowered or expected to push back and say, well, hey, is a webinar actually the right format for that? Or how do you know that this is the right topic? Any of that sort of vetting. It's just more that they say, okay, and then they head off and do their job to produce that webinar. And so what ends up happening is because of all this fragmentation and different folks involved, and if there is no clear accountability and responsibility, then you have the proverbial hand not knowing what the other hand is doing, and the portfolio then reflects that.
And so, all of this is, it's more than just an org chart issue. It's more than just an annoyance. And I imagine we've probably already got some heads nodding out there, listening to this as we go along, and probably recognize that this is a real business problem. This is fundamentally an issue with running a learning business effectively. It impacts revenue, it impacts resource allocation, and it has significant opportunity costs that go with it.
Well, that's right. If staff are producing a large number of offerings and doing that primarily because various groups are requesting them, that's going to keep them busy, which means they're going to have less time for what might be more important, more strategic work. And that speaks to that opportunity cost that you just mentioned, Jeff.
Right. In this scenario, this situation we're talking about, decisions about things like modality, for example, will often get bundled into content requests without really being examined. So, you get the request for a webinar on X, and that may identify a real and legitimate topic need. Often, you're going to be getting that from a volunteer committee or something like that. And they know the field or industry they're serving. They know it's a legitimate topic, but that may not be the right format or product response. They may not, they don't have the understanding of what formats are going to align with what learning objectives and what business objectives and that sort of thing.
That's right. And so it could be that instead of a webinar on X, you need a journal article on X, right. Or maybe you need a deep dive course on X. And so what's happening in all these situations is accidental governance. And so rather than having deliberate and conscious and well-informed decision-making, you're sort of running on this sort of the way we've done things and this more ad hoc hodgepodge approach to governing what goes into your portfolio.
Right. And so, what we're arguing for is not necessarily more or less bureaucracy. It's really just getting at the heart of how real decisions about the business are being made and how do you get a clear process around that.
So one of the key distinctions that we want to touch on is that input is not the same as decision rights.
That's right. I mean, committees and subject matter experts obviously can provide valuable input on topics, on needs, on realities from the field, the industry, the profession. But that input should be a point of departure, not the final answer, not what we just talked about where it's going to be a webinar on X, go make it.
That's right. And so, like you said, it's that input can be very valid, but it's not necessarily the final determination. It's not the final determination about content or modality or even that anything needs to be done because, again, there needs to be some level of professionalization around how these decisions are being made, and that usually it's going to be education staff who, for example, understand better which modalities can serve which purposes, or instructional designers that understand which types of activities might support the specified or the desired learning outcomes. And so you want to work in collaboration with your volunteers and your subject matter experts, but ultimately decision-making needs to kind of reside at a higher level.
That's right. In addition to, modality, design, those sorts of things, there is the business side of this. So how do you price things? That certainly should not be coming out of a committee. That, again, should be left to professionals, which may be the education staff, or it may be the education staff in collaboration with marketing, with finance. But you want the people who really have the expertise and the experience and are looking at the learning business as a business to be making those sorts of decisions.
Running a learning business today requires attention to growing reach, generating revenue, and demonstrating real impact, all while navigating constant change and fierce competition for learners' time and money.
To help, we've curated a collection of free resources for learning business professionals. You'll find frameworks, briefings, and reports, webinars, and tools focused on strategy, portfolio design, pricing, marketing, and more, all created specifically for organizations that sell continuing education and professional development.
If you care about building a stronger, more sustainable learning business, visit leadinglearning.com/free resources.
That's leadinglearning.com/free resources for practical tools and strategic insight to help you grow your reach, revenue, and impact.
And I think there's a hidden or shadow problem underneath the problem that we've been talking about. I think that the issue often gets interpreted as, well, we have too many cooks in the kitchen. There are too many people involved in these decisions. The committees are making things messy. And I think that's the interpretation because it's easy to see those aspects of it. It's very visible when you have a lot of committees. It's very visible when you have a lot of people contributing input. But underneath, there's a more fundamental breakdown. The organization hasn't been clear about how portfolio management is supposed to work.
That's right. I mean, it's a process issue in the sense that there's not a common understanding of how that decision process is supposed to flow, which should be that to start with, someone has to coordinate the information needed to make good decisions and be responsible for there being good information and that information being available to people. Then someone has to turn that information into possible offerings or moves that you're going to make with your portfolio.
And then somebody has to look at those ideas of possible offerings, portfolio moves, and say, okay, then this is what's going to need to be created. This is what we're going to need to update. This is what we're going to need to get out of our portfolio entirely and sunset it. And then, of course, once those decisions are made about what's being created, maintained, or sunset, someone has to make sure that those decisions are enacted, that creation gets done, that item gets removed from the online catalog, and so on.
So in many organizations, that whole process is diffuse. All of those stages are fragmented. There may be sort of somebody nominally in charge, but really it's not clear who truly has responsibility, who truly has accountability for the decisions. And the 4 steps of the process are not really being tightly coordinated and accounted for in the way they should be. So if you start with 1, gathering and synthesizing input/data, someone has to be ultimately accountable for and responsible for that happening. Doesn't mean that they're doing all of it. There's probably going to be multiple people involved in giving that input and looking at that data. Somebody has to be responsible, though, for that happening on an ongoing basis for the organization. From our perspective, that's probably the learning business leader ultimately who's making that decision. Certainly it is a staff person. That should not be allocated to a committee or a board. And if it's not the learning business leader, then it needs to be somebody who's been clearly deputized within the learning business to say, this is your role. This is what you're accountable for.
And you said, probably not a board, probably not a committee. Again, just to be really clear, a committee may be providing some of that input.
Probably will be, yes.
The board is probably providing some of that input. But again, you have to have someone who is responsible for making sure that the appropriate input and data is gathered and synthesized.
And that the process is working and that the process is achieving what it is supposed to be achieving. That's for step 1. And then you got step 2, generating and testing ideas. Again, You might have many people involved with that, but there needs to be a person who is responsible and accountable for that. Again, our view is that person should be on staff in the learning business, probably the learning business leader or somebody who's really been deputized to play that particular role.
And so at this stage, you might be doing things like, okay, we're going to develop a minimum viable product, for example. I mean, this is the level of like piloting and testing ideas, or, sending out an A/B email test. This is what's happening at that step. And again, you are probably pulling from a variety of sources, but somebody is ultimately responsible for generating and testing those ideas.
Right. And the person who's ultimately responsible and accountable doesn't mean that they are doing this work hands-on. We're talking about leadership and management here. There needs to be clear leadership, management, and the responsibility and accountability that comes with it for each step in this process. We've talked about gathering and synthesizing input and data. Step 1. Step 2 is generating and testing ideas. Step 3 is going to be making those explicit portfolio decisions. Certainly, learning business leaders should be responsible and accountable there. And then 4th is executing. And generally, it's not going to be the learning business leader who's actually developing or designing and developing programs and that sort of thing, but that person needs to be accountable and responsible, or have a clear deputy who is responsible for that aspect of the process.
Right. Again, management, oversight, leadership, not the hands-on work of it, but still somebody has to be responsible and make sure that that execution is happening.
And this all needs to be clearly defined and communicated and followed as a process.
Right. For the sake of the podcast, we're saying somebody, that somebody would be named in your organization.
Right.
You would know who it is there. The other point I would like to make about these 4 steps that you just were talking through, Jeff, is that it's a loop. These are not linear steps. You start at 1 and you end at 4. This is a loop, because after you get to that step 4 execution, there's going to be new data and there's going to be more input, and you want to learn from those results. And so this flow from information to ideas to decisions to action, that's a cycle, and it repeats, and it's going to repeat hopefully ad infinitum as long as you as a learning business are in business.
Right. That's a theme that runs through, I think, all of our tools and all of our work, is that all of this is cyclical. It repeats over time and improves over time.
So let's talk a little bit about what this might look like in practice. We've been saying someone, somebody, but as I just mentioned, you would ideally know in your organization who that somebody is. Not even ideally, you need to know who that somebody is. However, the reason we're using somewhat generic terms like somebody, someone, is because we don't believe that there's a single best practice or a universal model for this.
Right. And I'll say, so much of this comes down to just communicating very clearly, making sure people know what the process is, know what their role in the process is, know what the desired outcomes are, and who's going to be responsible and accountable for those outcomes. So better does not necessarily mean changes to your existing committee structure or to departments or units in your organization, but it does mean establishing those clearer responsibilities, clearer accountability, clearer decision rights throughout the process for the roles within the process.
Right. And part of that will be that then the people giving input know what kind of input they're giving. Are they giving, input around modality? Or are they giving input more around what are the hot topics needed in the profession? You're really clear with them, and they're really clear with what you're going to do with the input that they're giving. A better approach to governance and decision-making means that there's going to be a visible party or parties who are responsible for overseeing the whole portfolio. Everyone's going to know who that person or who that small group is who is shepherding those 4 steps that we were talking about, and who is ultimately responsible for what happens at each of those steps.
Right. And this may be, we find it often is a smaller group of people than is often the case in many organizations right now. And it typically is, if you are a member organization, for example, you typically are going to have key committee members or key volunteers involved. But staff are really going to be guiding that. They're going to have the charge for making sure that it's operating correctly. And staff really need to have the authority to make the business and product decisions that come out of whatever those groups are that are looking at the input and generating the ideas.
And part of the reason why having that authority reside with staff is that, well, there are a couple, but one, the staff are usually going to have some domain expertise around things like modality, or they're going to have better visibility into the business view of what to offer. And then at least two, they're going to also have that view of the whole portfolio. So often, a committee, like we were saying, perhaps they're really only hands-on around the development of content for the annual conference, and they might not really understand what you have in terms of self-paced online learning, for example. So both because of domain expertise and expertise of how the learning business is running as a learning business, it makes sense for staff to have the authority for decisions.
Right. And, the bottom line goal here is what better amounts to is just really being sure that someone, and usually a small set of someone's, are actually seeing the whole portfolio, everything that you're really trying to do from a learning perspective as an organization, and are making coherent decisions about it that somebody is ultimately responsible and accountable for.
And you said coherent. And coherent decisions, to my mind, recalls coherent actions, which calls to mind strategy. And I think buried in what you were saying there, Jeff, is just this fact that you cannot make sane portfolio decisions if you aren't clear on who you're serving and what role learning is playing in that service to those people.
Right. It's very true, but we see organizations do it all the time. They start, reworking the portfolio, assuming that adjustments here and there in the portfolio are the answer to everything, but they haven't understood or gotten to that underlying strategy as the touchstone that keeps, all of the different input that you're going to get around portfolio decisions from just being noise and putting in this place where it's action is hard to achieve. Putting new things in is hard to achieve. Certainly getting rid of things is hard to achieve. Yeah,
so without that touchstone of strategy, every request can sound sort of reasonable and maybe even equally important. It gets really hard to prioritize. But when you are referring back to the strategy, when you have that strategy in place, when everyone's using it as that touchstone, then decisions do get easier. It becomes clearer to everyone involved why one idea gets the go-ahead and maybe another one gets sidelined.
Right. And this is this is really the foundational part of everything we said about communication earlier. Is the strategy has to be clear, and it has to be clearly communicated to the people who are participating in the thinking and the decisions around your portfolio. If that's not there, then you're just sort of operating on shifting sands from the get-go.
Right. So just to kind of say that again, because I think it's it's an obvious but such an important observation, which is that before you can be clear about any of your portfolio decisions, you need to have clarity around what your learning business is trying to do.
Right. So as we wrap up our discussion here around portfolio management, portfolio governance, we want to offer some questions that can assist you in getting clarity around the right approach to the governance of education for your learning business.
So we have a handful of questions to suggest, and if you answer these questions, it's going to give you the lay of the land. It's going to help you understand how things are currently operating in your learning business. So who is currently seeing the full learning portfolio?
And it may be nobody. That's you need to make sure. Hopefully somebody is. If they aren't, then that's obviously you need to address that right away. The second one is who is responsible for gathering and synthesizing the relevant information, the data that you need to make good portfolio decisions.
Where are ideas generated and how are those ideas validated?
Who has the authority to decide what gets created, maintained, or sunset?
Which decisions belong to staff and which belong to volunteers or committees? So again, answering those questions is going to give you the current lay of the land. But then what you want to do is essentially re-ask those questions, but with a future orientation, with an eye to what would result in stronger offerings, a stronger learning business.
So the first would be who should see the full learning portfolio. If hopefully you have somebody who currently does, but is that the right person? Is that the right set of people going forward?
Who should be responsible for gathering and synthesizing the relevant information, that input and that data?
Where should ideas be generated and how should they be validated?
Who should have the authority to decide what gets created, maintained, or sunset?
And then which decisions should belong to staff and which inputs belong to volunteers or committees?
So again, back to a point that we opened with, decisions about your education portfolio are being made.
Obviously.
The question is whether they're being made consciously, coherently, and by the right people. So that's what we're encouraging you to assess and to evaluate. When the roles, responsibilities, and decision rights are fuzzy, your education portfolio usually falters.
Addressing governance issues around your portfolio should not shut out useful input from volunteers, committees, or subject matter experts. Cleaning up your governance should ensure that input is connected to a clear process for turning information into ideas, ideas into decisions, and decisions into action.
And it should ensure someone is seeing the whole portfolio and making coherent decisions about what gets created, maintained, improved, or removed.
You can find show notes, a transcript, and related resources at leadinglearning.com/episode 476.
And if you find the Leading Learning podcast valuable, please consider sharing this episode with a colleague or coworker who's wrestling with portfolio decisions or education governance issues.
Thanks for listening, and see you next time on the Leading Learning podcast.